Perfect. We're reserving the chat only for the hands up when we have our question and answers session. So if you need to be right back, perfectly okay during this presentation, just to kind of go and come back as quickly as possible. Alrighty. So good afternoon, guests, students, families, and teachers. My name is Michael Wasserstein, and I'm the English and Jewish Studies teacher at OJCS. We are here today to learn together. The great civil rights leader, Martin Luther King Jr., stated, "The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education." I believe that knowledge, understanding, and empathy are essential qualities of any community. The purpose of this discussion is to listen and learn about the inequality that still exists today. We feel very fortunate to have Briellen Griffin, Kayne Alleyne-Adams, and Dr. Mitzmacher to help us create connections between the past and the present and allow us to create a better future together. I will ask students to write down their questions and comments during the presentation and hold them until our guests have concluded. There will be a dedicated period of time for questions and answers. Briellen Griffin is going to begin our discussion. She is originally from Minneapolis, but is currently living in Chicago and recently completed her PhD in education and race. Briellen is a scholar and writer for Black humanity. Her work focuses on the intersection of education and race, with specific interests in anti-Blackness in schools. She teaches about race in education at Loyola and DePaul University and has recently become the Director of Professional Development for Grow Your Own Illinois, a state legislated organization that recruits and supports Black, Indigenous, and people of color teachers for the public school system. Bree is committed to helping teachers understand systemic racism, explore racial bias, and is working to develop anti-racist pedagogy in their classrooms. Today, she will teach us about the history related to institutionalized racism in the United States. Please help me welcome Briellen Griffin to the Google Meet stage.
Hey everybody, I'm excited to be starting. I am, to be fair, I just want to put out there that I haven't actually defended my dissertation. I have like 2 weeks left, so we're gonna hold on to the Dr. Griffin, but I have a few more weeks, so cross your fingers for me. And if anybody doesn't know, that just means I have to basically stand up in front of a group of people, and because of Zoom and technology, family and friends, and share my research with them. And then a bunch of people from my university get to tell me whether or not I did the research right. So hopefully it will go well. But that's not why I'm here today. I'm here to talk to you about systemic racism in the United States. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. And thank you for the tutorial, Ms. Thompson, because I have been using Zoom most of the time. So here we go. All right, can everyone see that okay? So, like I said, today we're going to talk about the origins of systemic racism in the United States. And if you don't really know yet what systemic racism is, that's okay. We're going to talk about it a little bit more. One of the main questions that I know many of you have and many people have is, why are people protesting right now? If you're watching the news or you're watching social media, you're seeing a lot of people out in the streets. You may have been out yourself protesting. So to understand why protests are happening in the US and around the world, we need to think about how racism became the foundation of US society. If you look, should be on the left of your screen, you'll see a poster that's from an organization, and it's a picture from one of the protests. And on the sign, you'll read, it says, "Black people are literally saying, 'Stop killing us.'" And there are people saying, "But..." So it's this idea, right, that we shouldn't have to argue for Black humanity, right? We shouldn't have to be questioning whether or not racism should end. So we're going to talk about why it's so deeply embedded in our society in the US. There are a couple major historical things that happened over time in the United States, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit in chronological order. So one of the first really important things is the idea of Indian removal. And I put that in quotations because that is what it is called. However, it's really about the destruction of indigenous communities through disease and stolen land. And that happened, we know, right, over a long period of time. And I'm sure you all have learned about that in Canada as well. But in the US, we talk about sort of this turning point around 1830 to 1845, when the US government really took over the entirety of what we now consider to be the United States. And indigenous people were really and truly reduced. Alongside that, we also had the legal enslavement of African Americans. And legal is really important here because it's the idea that it was written in law from as early as the early 1600s, right, until 1865. And what this essentially meant was that if you were Black in the United States, then you could legally be held as a slave. We hear oftentimes about narratives of people who were not enslaved, and there are a lot of different reasons why that was. However, many states made it so that if you were Black, you were essentially a slave. And so that meant that you were the property of another person. You didn't have the same rights as anyone else. And so this happened, if we think about that amount of time, we're talking about, 300-ish years, then what we're seeing is generations and generations and generations and generations of people being born into slavery and not having the same rights, and simply because of skin color, right? After slavery ended, and this is where our timeline on the right gets really helpful, right? We had a period of segregation called Jim Crow, and that refers to the laws that were put in place after Black people were legally freed, after slavery legally ended, to control Black people. So to put it really simply, when Black people were enslaved, they provided a free labor force for the United States. So I have ancestors that are both white and that are both Black. I'm a very white looking, we often call it white passing Black woman. So a lot of people don't know that, right? But I can trace in my own history people who were slave holding and people who were enslaved. And so what that meant at the time was that the labor of my Black ancestors was free, right? When slavery ended, all of a sudden, especially the South in the United States, lost that free labor force. And they were pretty upset about it because it meant that the cost of doing business went up a lot for them. And so they created a series of laws, started in the South, but really rippled everywhere throughout the country, that affected and restricted the lives of Black people. And one of the ways that that was the most effective, right, the way that they were able to keep Black people marginalized, was through what we call criminalizing, like, their daily actions. So if you were Black and walking down the street, if a white person questioned you about where you were supposed to be and they didn't like your answer, you could be put in jail. It was like that simple. So that became the beginning of what we call mass incarceration, which was like a transition of essentially moving Black peoples who had been enslaved, right, into prisons in order to continue that free labor. We don't talk a lot about the connection between slavery and mass incarceration, but there's a direct lineage there. I also want to point out on our slide that through this process, we didn't have obviously just Indigenous people, just Black people, and just white people in the United States, right? There were many other racial groups, and they oftentimes were subject to similar laws as Black people over time. So while, for example, Chinese Americans who have been in the US since at least the 1800s didn't experience the same enslavement that Black people did, they were still marginalized. They still had fewer rights. And so if we think about this timeline, right, that we see on our right, we have almost really into the present that Black people's lives in particular have been really restricted by the law. So what it means to be white in the US and what it means to be Black in the US are fundamentally different things. It doesn't mean that all Black people don't have certain, I wouldn't say privileges, but for example, people in my family have an education. That wasn't possible during slavery, right? But what it means to be white and what it means to be Black in the US are fundamentally different. A really important element of that is white privilege. which means essentially that white skin gives you better treatment and social advantage in society. And that's really tied to this idea of slavery, right? Where we had the system that enslaved people, didn't just separate people, right? But enslaved people based on skin color. That meant that if you were white, you had privilege. You weren't going to be enslaved because of your skin color. And that is something that continues to last through today. There's also historical advantage, right? So thinking about this idea of slavery, thinking about the indigenous removal of people, all laws and policies in the US have been designed to advantage white people. And at first it was a really small group of white people, and then that group of white people grew. So as more people came to the US from different parts of Europe, gradually they were folded into what it meant to be white. And so if your skin is the right color, including my skin, right? Even though I have Black ancestry and I identify as a Black woman, I still received white privilege, right? Both as a result of my skin color and as a result of the historical advantages that people in my family received. The other part about being white is that oftentimes seeing racism in the ways that Black people experience racism, for example, can be difficult. In part because if you are white, you don't experience that same kind of racism. And that's really folded into this idea of white privilege. Doesn't mean that you don't recognize when a racist act happens to a person, but it does mean that maybe you have a lot of blind spots in terms of understanding how racism operates on a lot of different levels. It's also easier to ignore racism if you're white. And ignoring racism is really important from thinking about it as an idea, right? Because it's very different than the idea of being anti-racist. Anti-racist is being actively against racism. You can say, I'm not racist, but if you say, I'm not racist, and then you don't actually do anything to break apart racism, to counteract a racist action that you see, to write a letter to your legislator about a policy that's racist, then you're not really anti-racist. You're not really working against racism. And so then racism continues to work because you're ignoring it. What it means to be Black in the US is that freedom, legal freedom, does not mean social equality with white people. So for all of the ways that we've said, it means to be white in the US, right? The freedoms that white privilege allows does not exist in the same way for Black people. It doesn't mean that Black people are not actually just human in being equal to other humans, right? It means that our society does not treat Black people equally. And part of that is because the legal oppression of folks in many ways of Black people ended, but de facto oppression remains, which means that the ways that people view laws and practice laws, the way that people create policies, the way that people respond to Black people, which is a lot of what we've seen in the news lately, right, is different. So one example of this is what we've heard a lot about recently, which is police brutality against Black people. And I'll use Minneapolis as an example because one, that is where I'm from. And then two, Minneapolis has been in the news a lot lately because of George Floyd. So if you look at this little chart on your right-hand screen, this bar graph, you'll see that Black people are represented by these purple lines. So as a share of the population in Minneapolis, Black people are 19% of the population. That's in the city of Minneapolis, right? Only 9% of the police officers in Minneapolis are Black. However, people who are stopped, detained by the police, arrested by the police, right, where police use force, 58% of those cases are Black people. It doesn't make sense, right? When we think about if we were really being treated equally in this space, if white people and Black people were being treated equally in Minneapolis, then there shouldn't be a disparity. There shouldn't be a difference in the statistics, right? It would sort of stand to reason that the amount of really negative experiences that one has with the police should correspond to maybe how many of us are existing in the space. And that's what we don't see. If you can look on like any metric in terms of police brutality, in terms of education, in terms of imprisonment, in terms of access to good food, in general, Black people have experienced a disproportional amount of inequality in their lives. So I wanted to end today by talking a little bit about the idea that Black Lives Matter, which is a hashtag that you see everywhere. You're seeing it all over posters right now. A lot of people have different associations with the Black Lives Matter movement. The information that I have for you today on the screen are statements that are specifically from the Black Lives Matter organization and movement. And the reason that I have them here for you today is because I think that a lot of people associate, especially a lot of white people that I've met, have really negative associations with Black Lives Matter, especially those who aren't out protesting, right, alongside of us. And so I wanted to show you some of the kinds of language, right, and then also talk about why it's important. So I'll read the statements. The first one is, we acknowledge, respect, and celebrate differences and commonalities. The second one is, we work vigorously for freedom and justice for Black people, and by extension, all people. We embody and practice justice, liberation, and peace in our engagements with one another. This is important because the Black Lives Matter movement is about Black people, because Black people have been historically and are currently marginalized, right? And we know that if one part of our society is being marginalized, then all of us are not equal, right? All of us are not experiencing the kind of humanity that we should be experiencing. So a really important point, like a political point of the Black Lives Matter movement, is that this is about our collective humanity. This is about how we are collectively treated in the US, in this country, and then around the world, right? It's not just about Black people. It's just that Black people, the treatment of Black people is helping us know that the rest of us are not doing our part. And the last thought I wanted to leave you with is a statement from Ijeoma Oluo, who's an author. And she wrote a book called So You Want to Talk About Race, and a few other books and blogs. But she says the beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself, and it's the only way forward. And I think this quote is really important because we can't escape racism. It is all around us, whether you're white, whether you're Black, whether you are Indigenous, whether you are aware of it or not. But the important part is the awareness. It's learning to be aware, and it's learning to actively work against that, right? Whether it's a feeling of prejudice within you, whether it's a law or policy that you see, it's not enough to just let it go or maybe feel guilty about it. We have to actually take action to make sure that things will actually change. And the last thing, one thing that I shared with your teachers, which they can pass on to you as well, are some resources. If you want to learn more about talking about race, the U.S. National Museum of African American History and Culture has a really cool interactive web portal that you can check out. There's also a really neat book out called Stamped, Racism, Anti-Racism, and You, that's written directly and kind of pointedly towards your age group and teaches you a lot about the history of racism in the US. And then there's another book called This Book is Anti-Racist, which is kind of a workbook, and it helps you to think through ideas of race and decide how you can take action on racism. So thank you very much. I'm going to unshare my screen.
Alrighty, thank you very much. And just so the students are aware, we can definitely post these PowerPoints and those resources on our blogs for you to reference. And thank you, Bree, for all of your important and meaningful information.
Of course.
Next we have Kayne Alleyne-Adams, a sociology student at York University, who has been very outspoken about combating anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination. Kayne has gone through the CJPAC Fellowship in the 2019-2020 class and has worked with various federal and provincial parties on several projects. As a young Black member of the LGBT community, civil rights have always been a personal battle for Kayne, as he has seen firsthand how discrimination and prejudice can affect people. Kayne will be discussing the history of racism in Canada, along with his personal narrative. Please help me welcome Kayne to the Google Meet stage.
Hello, everyone. Hello. I'm just going to quickly switch over to, sharing my screen. One quick second. Here we are. All right. Can you guys see my screen? Hold on, let's see.
We can see it.
You can see it? Okay, perfect, perfect. All right, so before I begin, I just want to give a quick thanks to everyone for letting me come here and talk a little bit about the history of racism in Canada. I think that it's, honestly speaking, I think the first step in anti-racism and just developing a culture of anti-racism that happens in education. And I think that it's very important that these conversations are happening now. That being said, before I go on, I just want to say that I am tuning in from Toronto, and the specific area where I'm tuning in from are the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabe peoples. Those are the Native American peoples, the indigenous peoples who used to live where I currently do live, and I think it's important that I recognize that before I begin. Anyways, so on the screen here, I have a little bit of a short timeline of racism in Canada, and I want to talk a little bit about Canada before I actually even begin with this. So firstly, I think it's important just to note that in Canada, we have this general view that racism is an American problem. It's an American issue, that racism happens south of the border, and in Canada, we're a little bit better than that. In Canada, we're a lot better than that. We like to believe that in Canada, at least people that I know like to believe in Canada, that we have everything sorted out. But in actuality, in truth, Canada has also had an extremely harsh history of racism against many people, Black Canadians and Indigenous Canadians being among them. And the history of racism for Black Canadians in Canada didn't necessarily begin with slavery, but that's where I'm going to start off the story. There were quite a few thousand slaves on Canadian soil at any point in time. Slaves that were being treated as subhuman, slaves that weren't necessarily even given the right to control their own actions, being told where and when to work, and being forced to work as such. And yeah, that existed for quite a few hundred years. And during that time period, there were many Canadian slaves, as a matter of fact, who did actually journey south of the Canadian border, south to the United States, in an attempt to escape Canadian slavery, just as slaves travel along the Underground Railroad to Canada to escape American slavery. Even if Black people were free at the time, there were oftentimes very specific laws that prevented Black people all across Canada from existing. In 1785, in a city near Halifax, there was a bill that was passed that essentially banned all versions of Black culture, Black dances, Black music from being publicly pronounced, from being used in the streets, or even just existing. There were about 50 to 60 separate laws across the country, across modern day Canada, that prevented Black culture from existing at this time. And even after slavery, I want to talk a little bit about Africville, which existed from 1848 to 1969. It was a predominantly, well, almost exclusively Black community. A couple pictures I have actually right here. So Africville was a community that was just slightly off of Halifax, a community that, as a matter of fact, paid taxes to Halifax and paid to have, just like any other citizen, paid for education, paid for clean streets, paid for water, paid for policing, paid for all of these, paid for healthcare, paid for all of these human rights that the city would usually provide to them. But Africville, they did not receive these rights, despite the fact that they paid for them. The citizens of Africville, as I mentioned before, were majority, perhaps even all African Canadians, former slaves that were forced to live within this community that didn't receive proper support. In this picture on the right, I know it's a little bit blurry, but there's a sign there that says, right around here, that says, please boil this water before cooking and drinking. Which, I mean, that just shows how little support the people of Africville received from the Canadian government. And that there existed all the way up until the 1960s, almost even until the 1970s. Now to move on to talk a little bit about the Indigenous history in Canada. Firstly, I want to talk a little bit about Indigenous slavery, because that did exist as well. about 1/3 of all Canadian slaves, 1 to 2/3, depending on the time history, timeline of all Canadian slaves were Indigenous. And they too were treated extremely poorly, treated subhumanely, and forced to do work that most of the time was backbreaking, that was extremely difficult labor that even nowadays we don't expect to be done by most people. That being said, I do want to show a little bit of something to you guys. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Here we are. All right, so I just want to talk a little bit about Indigenous history and just a little bit of a way that kind of made a lot of sense to me. I'm a visual learner, so to me, seeing something a little bit bright and colorful, such as this, really helps me out. So this right here, this cup, this little mason jar, it represents Canadian land in the hands of Indigenous peoples. So back before the nation of Canada existed, all Canadian land belonged to Indigenous people, or in this case, all of the 50 Sour Patch Kids belonged to the Indigenous people. But as time went on, a lot of that land, most of that land even, was shifted into the hands of the state of Canada. Now I want you guys, all of you sitting at home, inside of the chat function, to put maybe an X when you think that's the amount of land that Indigenous people have to this day. Just put an X in the chat, the amount that's in here. I'm going to start transferring them over and you let me know, okay? So I'm going to start off with something small. So far, there's only 2 in here. There's 48 in here. Who believes that Indigenous people have about 48 out of 50? No, I'm not seeing anyone. Okay. Moving forward. There's quite a bit more, maybe about 7 in here. I'm still not seeing anyone. All right, quite a bit more. It's about 50-50 now. Who believes that Canadian land is about 50-50, owned by the Canadian government, owned by Indigenous peoples? I see 1 X in the chat, but beyond that, not too much more. I'm going to continue on a little bit. Now it's about, let's say, 60-40. 60% in here, 40% in here. 40% for Indigenous people. Do we got any takers, any buyers? No, so far not seeing anyone more. Now it's practically about maybe 80%, 80-20%. I'm seeing quite a few X's in the chat, quite a few people. You know, I think we're getting close. I think we're getting close. All right, now there's only 4 left in here. So 4 out of 50. Who thinks that sounds about right? All right, we're getting a lot of X's in the chat, quite a bit, but it's still not correct. Still not quite. 1, we got 1 here. We got 49 here. Who thinks that's right? All right, we're getting quite a few more X's in the chat, but what if I told you that it's still not quite correct? That we got to take this boy, we got to break him in half, we got to break him in half again, got to break him in half 1 more time, and this is about it. It's this little tiny dot right here. You can barely even see it. That is right now, Indigenous Canadians have about 0.2% of Canadian land. It's tiny. It's barely anything. As a matter of fact, it's if it was its own nation, it would be one of the smaller nations in the world. I'm going to just head back to my presentation to continue on. 1 quick moment. All right. So that's the Indigenous Crown Treaties section, where Indigenous peoples and the government were kind of going into some treaties and talking about, hey, like we're going to give the Indigenous people were talking about which land they were going to have, whereas which land the government was going to have full control of. And as time went on, the government kept on pushing and pushing and pushing Indigenous people back further and further away. To the point where
I can't see your screen.
Oh, you can't see my screen?
I can't.
Okay, hold on 1 quick second. All right, I think we're good now.
Yeah, we can see it now.
All right, thank you for letting me know. All right, so as I was saying, that's the Indigenous Crown Treaties time period where Indigenous land was being more and more taken by the Canadian government, and Indigenous people were having less and less ability to control their own land. Now, it went even further than that. At a certain point, the Canadian government decided that Indigenous people shouldn't even have a right to their own culture. They shouldn't have a right to their own ideologies, their religions, their own cultural practices. So residential schools began in around 1880, sorry. And one famous quote from a lawmaker at the time was that the residential schools were set up to kill the Indian in the child, or to remove, that cultural influence, to remove that entire cultural idea from the children. And these residential schools, they were extremely, extremely abusive. There were many cases where children died in these schools while they were being taken away from their parents and being forced to live far and far away, most of the time never to see their parents again. And the last of these schools closed in 1996. That's just 4 years before I was born. That right there, that's 26 years ago. In the end of the day, that's in the grand scheme of things, that's very, very recently. Anyways, I'm going to be moving on to the next point to talk a little bit more about modern anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism in Canada. So to start off, I just want to let you guys know I'm going to be saying a lot of numbers, and I don't expect all of you to remember all these numbers, but you're going to have access to these slides later, so you can look back at these numbers if you ever really need to, double check anything. But to start off, Black Canadians are only 3% of Canada's population, but they are also 36.5% of people who are killed by the Toronto police. They're also 10% of the federal prison population. Furthermore, Black Canadians have a lower life expectancy, meaning they live for shorter amounts of time than white Canadians do. And the reason why they live for a shorter amount of time has nothing to do with biology, and it has nothing to do, well, it does have a little bit to do, but it doesn't primarily have to do with healthcare, but it has a lot to do with how many racist systems exist and how many of these racist systems directly attack the ability for Black Canadians to exist peacefully. Now, moving on to Indigenous peoples as well. They are only 4% of Canada's population. However, they are 30% of Canada's federal and provincial prison population. And at the most, in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, they are 75% of all prisoners. Many Indigenous communities still lack access to clean water, and many Indigenous peoples have a lowered life expectancy, with the lowest amongst them, the lowest Indigenous community life expectancy is at 62, which is nearly 20 years younger, which is nearly 20 years less than the average Canadian life expectancy. That to me, just something seems wrong about that. There's an issue here, and we need to really dive into this issue if we're going to get to fix it, right? Anyways, here are some more stats. I'm not really going to go into them. I just wanted these to be available to you guys if you ever wanted to come back and look at these. I also included a few names of some cases where Black and Indigenous peoples were killed by police officers or killed in incidents involving police officers. Chantel Moore was an Indigenous woman, I believe 26-year-old, who was killed last week by a police officer. So this is something that affects us in Canada to this day, that affects us quite constantly. Anyways, moving on. Issues of racial discrimination in Canada aren't only about police brutality. I mean, the reason why a lot of these protests have began are because of police brutality in the States, but police brutality exists here as well. And furthermore, there's hiring discrimination. If someone has a name that seems more, that doesn't seem quote unquote white or doesn't seem, quote unquote normal, they are less likely to be hired, even if they have a better resume, even if they have more experience. There's also educational discrimination, where children are often looked down on by their teachers, are not given the same opportunities from their teachers due to their race or due to their religion as well. One example of this, because anti-Semitism is another issue of racial discrimination in Canada. One example of this is to do with a lot of the quota policies around Canada that do happen to disproportionately negatively affect Jewish people. But moving on as well, there's also media perpetuation, there's racist speech, and there's microaggressions. An example of a microaggression for me personally, I don't often, whenever I go outside, and I haven't done that recently, but whenever I go outside, almost every single day I'm outside, there's some random stranger who will try to touch my hair because they think it's interesting. And sure, it looks interesting. It's nice and curly and puffy and all. I don't know if y'all can see it, but normally it's all like this, right? Sure, it's interesting, but at the same time, it's extremely uncomfortable, and it's not something that, you know, people should experience. That's you know, breaking my personal space and my boundaries. But moving on to the next point, I didn't really write any slides for this one, and I'm going to kind of come back to you guys so I can see you face to face. But I just want to talk from the heart for a quick minute about my own personal experiences as a Black individual in Canada. So as I mentioned before, I grew up in Toronto, and I'm kind of lucky to have grown up in Toronto. It's a very diverse city. There are many Black people here. There are many people of all different ethnicities here. And because of that, no matter where I went in Toronto, I was always able to see, you know, people like me. I was always able to see people like my community. But diversity doesn't mean that there's no such thing as racism. I remember one of the first incidents of racism that really stuck with me is back when I was in, I think, grade 7 or grade 6. So around the age that you guys are now, I decided that I wanted to grow out my hair. So I grew it out a little tiny bit, not nearly as long as it is now, but I grew it out a little tiny bit, and I decided to get it in cornrows one day. And I went into the school, and I was taken to the principal's office, and I wondered, what did I do wrong? What could have I done wrong? Why am I being in trouble? Like, I just got to school. And the principal tells me, he says, Kayne, I'm sorry, but according to our school's rule book, you can't grow out your hair. So I asked him, well, why can't I grow out my hair? Like, my friend Luke, his hair is long. My other friend, his hair look long as well. Like, why can't I grow out my hair? And he showed me the rule book, and specifically in it, it specified that if your hair is curly and if you're a boy, you're not allowed to grow out your hair in this school. Now, I'm sure we can all agree that that is not okay, and that disproportionately affects people of color. It also affects a large amount of the Jewish population that does tend to have some more curly hair as well. And this was one way that that school specifically targeted people of color, just even if they didn't say, you know, Black people can't grow out their hair, they may as well have. Also in my life, I've seen my mother arrested 3 different times. And all 3 times she was arrested for crimes that she did not commit, arrested for crimes that she was not even close to involved with. And actually one of the times she was arrested after calling the police and telling them that someone broke into her house. She waited there for 3 hours, and when they finally arrived, they just assumed that she was the one who broke in and arrested her, oftentimes because of the color of her skin. And now, to me, what the police represent to me is a little bit different than what I'd imagine police represent to a lot of people. To a lot of people, police represent security. They represent safety. They represent someone being there to help. But whenever I see police, I can just see the times when they arrested my mother, and she would come back the next day, and her wrists would be bruised, and her face would be red, and she would be totally in emotional and sometimes even physical pain because what they did was not okay. And she simply experienced that because of the color of her skin. So now for me, at least, every time that I see a police officer, even if I didn't do anything wrong, even if I have no reason to be afraid, I feel afraid because I've seen what they can do. I've seen what they have done. And, maybe I haven't personally been arrested for something I haven't done, but I've seen it happen quite constantly. And that's just a fear that will always exist in the back of my mind. And that's something that, a lot of people of color experience quite constantly, that type of fear. Anyways, I do want to move along with my presentation. So I'm going to switch back to this thing here. One quick second. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about, what needs to change. And, right now, the Black Lives Matter protests in the States and in Canada as well, they're talking mostly about, policing, about what needs to change within the way that police interact with communities. And while that's important, I think that that's not everything that really needs to change. I think that we personally, as individuals, we have a lot that we need to do as well. But firstly, let's talk about the police. One thing that a lot of people are calling for is body cameras. They're calling for the necessity of body cameras on all police officers. And a body camera is a little tiny camera that they mostly wear on their chest or shoulder, like this kind of area here, that allows, that records everything that a police officer is doing, that's recording all situations, so that if a police officer is acting in a way that's racist, is acting in a way that's violent, that can be seen. Right now, in a very recent case in Toronto, as a matter of fact, there was a Black woman who died in a confrontation with police officers, and the police officers were not wearing their body cams. Or if they were, they turned their body cameras off. That right there ensures that no matter what happened, we can't know. We don't know what happened there because there's no way for us to see what happened there. That's why I personally believe that body cameras are necessary. Another big thing is a national database on the use of police force and fatal incidents with police. As it currently stands in Canada, there are no, and I repeat, no national accessible databases where police force or fatal incidents with police are recorded. There is no way for us Canadians to do a simple Google search and ask how many Black people were killed by police in Canada, because the police themselves don't keep full track of that information. There is an issue of racial discrimination and racial police violence in Canada, but we simply don't know what it is because we're not paying attention to it. We're not keeping track of it. We need to start keeping track of it. Further, my opinion is we also need to increase police training to do with conflict resolution, to do with de-escalation. When police go into a circumstance, when police go into a situation, their number one priority should be to make everything calm, to ensure that nothing worse happens, to ensure that no one's hurt. And as it currently stands, most police officers in Canada do not receive enough conflict resolution training to actually practice and do this. Some statistics, and I don't know the validity of these, so please don't quote me, but some statistics say that McDonald's employees have more conflict resolution training than police officers do in Toronto. And that's reflected in most police services across all of Canada. The fourth thing that I think needs to happen, and there can be a lot of debate on this, I know that some people won't agree, but the fourth thing I think needs to happen is that police need to be disarmed. In the end of the day, if police go into circumstances with a gun on their holster and with all these weapons that could easily end someone's life and have ended over 480 people's lives across Canada in the past few years, that should change. Police officers, much like they do in the UK or in many other countries across the world, should go to incidents without these weapons because these weapons shouldn't be necessary. But moving on, I think that it's very important to talk about what we ourselves can do to change things. And number one, and the biggest one in my personal opinion, is to change the narrative. I think that we, as people of color, and you guys as people of Jewish descent, as people who have been experiencing many forms of discrimination throughout our lives, I think it's necessary that when we talk about discrimination, even if it doesn't apply to us, or when we talk about protests, we need to talk in ways that value the lives of those who are involved. A lot of the arguments against the Black Lives Matter movement always talks about the small incidents where riots take place, the incidents where properties are destroyed. And while that's horrible, and while I personally don't think that riots should be happening, I personally believe that human life is always going to be more important than property. And in the end of the day, we need to talk about the importance of human life first. This here, I'm pretty sure this is either my last or my second last slide, but I just want to talk a little bit more about what we can do. What we can do as individuals to start changing up the system. And it goes from small things to big things to, kind of medium things, but to start it off, we can just talk about it. I think it's important to have difficult conversations about racism in Canada with our family and with our friends, to discuss, what's happening, to discuss how Black people and Indigenous people feel in Canada, just so that we can fully understand it and that it's something that's on our mind. I think it's also important, if you guys have social media, I don't know, but to start posting information on your social media and to start, you know, visibly showing it and visibly sharing it. In the end of the day, these issues exist, but if we don't talk about them, if we can't see them, it's so much easier to ignore them. If we show them, if we make sure that they're seen, it will be so much easier for us to make a change. Another big thing is to talk about the individuals, the Black and Indigenous and other races as well, the individuals who are killed by police officers and who are killed by RCMP officers as well. I think it's important to talk about their names because they were people. They're not just numbers, they're not just statistics, but they were, and there were people and they have families who are grieving them, and it's important to talk about them like people. And one big fourth thing, I think that this one's extremely important, but when someone, especially a person of color, talks about racism and talks about their experiences, I think it's good, just like you guys are doing right now, and thank you so much for this, but I think it's good to listen and to learn. Because in the end of the day, we each have individual experiences, and every one of our experiences is worthy of being learned from. Moving on to talk about how we can change our own actions. Step number one is to change some of the words we use. We should not use words like Indian or Eskimo to describe Indigenous peoples, as those words are extremely offensive towards a lot of Indigenous peoples, especially Eskimo. We should also not use words like thug to describe Black people, as the word thug has a very large history of racism in Canada and the United States. We should also stop saying thoughts and prayers when we see something happening that we disagree with, and we see something happening that makes us sad. Instead, we should start demanding action. And one big way to demand that action as well is to sign petitions. If someone's passing around a petition that says, to get body cameras on police officers, or to, a petition about, racism in education, I think it's great to read up on that, to read the petition, and if you agree with it, to sign it. And the next big thing is to call out the actions of others. In the end of the day, silence is compliance. And just like bullying, if we stay silent in a certain way, we're supporting what's happening. So if you see racism at all, if it's against Black people, Indigenous people, if it's against any people, I feel it's extremely important to call it out. Tell people that racism makes you feel uncomfortable, and send them resources that explain the history of Canadian racism and modern day racism. Anyways, this last one here, I just have some social media accounts that I thought might be interesting for you guys to read up on further. The first three, up on the top right over here, are mostly meme pages. Well, the first two are meme pages. The third one, Not Another Black Life, is a Black Lives Matter movement page. This fourth one here, that's my personal page. And the fifth one, that woman there, that's Annamie Paul's page. And she's a politician in Canada right now who's trying to make a lot of change to do with racial inequality. And up on the top right-hand corner right here, I have something that was said a little while back to me, and something that has really stuck with me. Black and Indigenous lives are not a trend. And even though they're all on social media, all in the news right now, we need to still be talking about these issues in 2 weeks. These issues are not a trend. They haven't just started, and they won't just stop. We need to keep this conversation going. Anyways, that is it.
I think we just had the classic Google Meet when you go to switch, and I think he left the meeting by accident there, but we can give him a round of applause when he comes back in, as I'm sure he will. So I think that Kayne did a really fantastic job providing us with some information and some direct steps that we can actually do, some accounts that you can also follow on social media. Last but certainly not least, we have our very own Dr. Mitzmacher, who's going to discuss the role the Jewish community has had in supporting the civil rights movements in the past, what our Jewish values teach us in forms of steps that we can take to become agents of change. Please help me welcome Dr. Mitzmacher to the Google Meet stage.
Okay. You're not going to read my entire biography, Mr. Wasserstein? That's okay.
Dr. Mitzmacher, I'm just going to interrupt you for a sec because Kayne just came back on. So Kayne, we did thank you we know you got kicked off by accident, but we see that you're back and we're happy that you're back, and thank you so much.
Okay,
Yeah, it was just a slight click just to explain, but yeah, thank you guys so much for the opportunity.
So I'm going to talk quickly because I want the focus to remain on our guests, and I want you to have plenty of time to ask them questions. I have plenty of opportunity to engage with you outside of this Google meeting, so I'm going to do this as quickly as I can. I think it's important when you're having a serious conversation to name your biases up front so that you can be clear and transparent about the perspective that you're sharing. So I will, for the sake of our guests and for those of you who need a reminder, I'll just remind you that I am American also. And so my education is from the States, and my education around race and racism and civil rights movement and the relationship between the Jewish community and civil rights, all of that is from an American perspective. So I'll just name that here. I have, in 8 minutes or less, I'm going to hopefully plant 2 ideas and show you 3 quick videos, none of which are more than 90 seconds to 2 minutes long. And for some of our grade 6s and grade 7s, the first 2 will be familiar. I have done a little bit of this with you during Tefillah over the last couple of weeks, but since perhaps not every student in grade 6 or 7 has been as diligent about either attending or participating in Tefillah as perhaps they would have if we were doing this in real life, it won't be such a tragedy if you hear it a second time. So the first big idea is just to be reminded, and I'm going to give you a visual to look at, that that the Jewish community and Jewish people have a natural responsibility and response when they see injustice and racism in the world. It's part of our imperative, part of our moral imperative to make the world a better place. And if you think about significant chunks of what's in the Torah, what's in our daily prayers, we are constantly reminded that we need to treat people with dignity and respect because we were once slaves ourselves. It's mentioned in so many of our prayers, and it is mentioned in so many of our biblical texts. And it's there for a reason. It's to remind us that we had this experience long time ago, understandably, but because of that experience, we are supposed to be paying attention to where we see slavery and other forms of injustice and discrimination in the world, and feel a personal responsibility to do something about it, because we should have empathy for that experience. And it's not just an ancient experience going all the way back to slavery in Egypt. There are more contemporary examples of the Jewish community standing up for civil rights. And I want to show you one of the most powerful ones, and that is the relationship between Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King Jr. And so I'm going to let the videos speak for themselves. One is 2 minutes, one is 90 seconds. Because it's Google Meet and there's so much bandwidth issues, I'm sure it'll take a couple minutes for it to go back and forth. So I'm going to mute myself here, and then I'm going to share my screen and show you these 2 quick clips, and then I will pick up on the other side with a point I'd like to make. So bear with me.
They come from such totally different backgrounds. My father from a Hasidic family in Warsaw, and Martin Luther King from a Baptist background in the American South. It's a very odd combination, and it's one of the American miracles. They had similar theological sensibilities. My father discovered a Christian who was making the Hebrew Bible the center of the American discussion. Amazing. And he was very moved by that. And the fact that my father wrote the book on the prophets also was very important. Andrew Young told me that everybody had a copy of that book on the prophets and carried around in their pocket.
And of course, I know I did, and I've kept it on my desk ever since. Yeah, it's one of the books when I move, I know where that book is.
I have always seen him as a kind of intellectual father. And whenever I get a little down or depressed, I go get one of his books and I read the prophet Isaiah and what he has to say about Isaiah. Because Isaiah was written at a time of the desolation of Israel. And yet it's the loftiest vision of dreams for humankind. It's people's ability to have faith in the midst of persecution and destruction that Black Americans tapped into. And if you notice Martin Luther King's speeches, he quotes from the prophets more than almost anybody else. And he got a lot of those insights from his study of Rabbi Heschel.
King was impacted by Heschel's analysis of the prophets. Heschel made the conviction of the prophet that God is here in our immediate struggle, and that God's struggle is a struggle to help those who are voiceless to find voice, those who are blind to find sight, that it's in that unique dimension that God is most present.
Coming up, he marched with Martin Luther King Jr. and was a longtime activist for civil rights and against war. Remembering rabbi, theologian, and mystic Abraham Joshua Heschel. This weekend of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, religious services are planned around the country to remember him and his legacy. Some of them will be in synagogues that are honoring both King and the late Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of King's many courageous supporters. Heschel is widely considered to be one of the greatest American religious figures of the last century, a rabbi, theologian, social activist, and mystic, admired by Christians as well as Jews. He would have been 101 years old this month. Our segment was produced by Steve Brand, a New York filmmaker who is completing a documentary on Heschel called Praying with My Legs. Brand gathered powerful recollections from those who had known him and who wish his prophetic voice were still sounding.
Pick 'em up and lay 'em down, right.
It was his participation in the civil rights movement that first made Heschel widely known. In a famous photo of the Selma March in 1965, its leaders wearing garlands. Heschel was the white man with the prophet's beard, two to the right of Dr. King. That was the occasion on which Heschel said he felt he was praying with his legs.
God is either the father of all men or of no men. And the idea of judging a person in terms of black or brown or white is an eye disease.
Heschel
Okay, so that's the first big idea. The first big idea is this notion of praying with our legs, that our faith calls upon us not just to pray with the words in our prayer book, but that our faith calls upon us to pray through action. It is not enough just to sit in sanctuary space, right? A prior guest talked about thoughts and prayers not being sufficient. Oftentimes that's used as a cliche, right? Obviously we take prayer seriously. Prayer has its place, but prayer is not sufficient. That in order to be fully engaged in the world, in order to us to fully act upon our faith and our Jewish values, that we're called upon at important moments in history to pray with our legs. And that example of Rabbi Heschel and Dr. Martin Luther King is among the most powerful examples of praying with our legs that I'm familiar with. But you don't have to be Rabbi Heschel, and you don't have to have a Dr. Martin Luther King to be praying with your legs. There's things big and small that we can be doing. And so that gets to my second point, is that for those of us who feel moved and inspired in this moment in time to want to do something, and our guests have given us some practical ways that we could start to do something, but it's for you to think about, how can you start to pray with your legs on this issue? What would that look like? And I'm going to give you an example from the news just from yesterday. So I'm going to show you a quick news clip from yesterday of a young woman who I would describe what she did as a way of praying with her legs. This is the last thing that I'm going to show you.
As hundreds of thousands march for justice across the country and in St. Louis, one recent college grad is using her voice in a different way.
With everything going on, I think it's really important that everyone is on the same page.
The same page of the dictionary, that is. Kennedy Meacham, a recent college graduate studying law, politics, and society, said the issue stemmed after people would quote the verbatim definition of racism.
A couple weeks ago, I was like, okay, this is the last argument I'm going to have about this. Like, I know what racism is. I've experienced it. So I emailed them.
According to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, racism is a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race.
I basically told them that they need to include that there's a systematic oppression upon a group of people. It's not just, oh, I don't like someone.
After back and forth emails, the editor of Merriam-Webster agreed, saying a revision to the entry of racism is now being drafted.
The reason the definition of racism in the dictionary isn't adequate is because it suggests that racism is just a passive kind of concept, whereas racism in actuality is a passive belief, but it also causes horrendous actions toward people who don't look like you.
Dr. Charlene Jones teaches political science at Harris-Stowe State University. She said from her students to people like Kennedy, the young generation will make this movement different.
And so I think everyone really needs to realize what their strengths are and how they can contribute to the movement. And once they do that, I think we're really going to be able to get some places.
So that's from yesterday's news. This is a young woman who I think no more than 2 or 3 weeks ago decided that the way she was going to pray with her legs was by praying through an email. That she just thought, hey, I'm going to email the dictionary and engage them in a conversation and to change the actual definition of racism. And she never imagined, there's a longer interview you can look up where she talks a little bit more about the experience, but she never imagined in a million years she was going to get a response, let alone have them actually go through the process of redefining the word racism. That's just something that she was motivated to do. She wanted to make a difference. She had something that she cared about, and she just sent an email, and now she has, in some significant way, changed the world. And so that's, for me, for you to be thinking about, is what is that going to be for you? What is the email that you're going to send? What is the voice you're going to listen to? What is the action that you're going to take? What are you going to do to be able to pray with your legs on this issue? And if there are ways that your teachers or that your school can support you in amplifying your voice, of course, we're here to do that. But that's really the charge. That's what our values call upon us to do. That's what our faith calls upon us to do. So I'm now going to stop talking and turn it back over to our guests and let you guys go through your Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Mitzmacher. So we'll now take some time to answer any questions that you've had, and you can show that you want to participate by writing hand up in the chat, and I'll call on you. The question can be, don't be fearful about asking anything, right? Feel comfortable to ask any question, anything that you want to learn more about. you can ask a panelist individually, like if you have a question about something specific, or you can just pose the question out loud, and we can let them choose who would like to answer it. Not all at once, as I typically say when we start these discussions. Is there any questions? Something that surprised you? Something that you'd like to learn more about? Go ahead, David.
I have a question. Where do the slaves come from?
This is a great question. I think that, I mean, at different times and different contexts, different kinds of people were enslaved, right? In the US and in Canada, as Kayne also shared, right? The indigenous people were enslaved, and then a lot of African people were enslaved. And so they were, in fact, from Africa and were captured, right? And taken in large amounts. So millions and millions of people were taken from Africa and brought to the United States, Canada, and then also other parts of the world, and huge amounts of folks in South America as well.
Any other questions that are coming to mind as of now? Otherwise, if you don't have a question right now, you can always ask your teachers the questions, and if we can't provide the answers, then we can always reach out. David, you have another question? Go ahead.
Is there also other country? Are there also other countries that also have or had slavery?
There were quite a few countries around the world that had slavery, specifically with the African slave trade, specifically with people being taken from Africa. The majority of it happened in North America, South America, the Caribbean, so Jamaica, Cuba, Trinidad and Tobago, the islands there, and a lot of it happened in Europe as well, the UK being a great large area for slavery.
Alrighty. If we don't have any other questions at this time, I just want to say thank you to Briellen, to Kayne, to Dr. Mitzmacher for sharing your time, your knowledge, and your perspective with our middle school community today. We thank you for the work that you do in your respective communities. And to our students, please remember that this is the start of an ongoing conversation, right? This isn't something that we're just talking about today. This is just the beginning of this conversation. And you have the power to take a stand and to speak out against the injustices that you see in the world. So thank you for everyone who participated today, and we really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely, my pleasure to be here, by the way.
I second that. Thank you so much. Thank you. It was so informative and wonderful, and a really important conversation for us to be having. And as Mr. Wasserstein said, just our first step in change, and it starts with all of us. So thank you again.